So within the Squares and Streets districts, there's no parking minimum that is in the districts themselves.
Okay.
But what we've seen, so one thing, and I think it's helpful to clarify in all the spaces I am, there's a lot of folks who think that Rosendale is the first place where we're doing squares and streets with the zoning, and it's not. Mattapan has had squares and streets zoning for a year, and we've started to see a small turnout. So I think what Burhan is mentioning, Eric, as well, a small turnout of some projects that are within squares and streets districts, and it's been interesting to see that of two projects that I've seen that are at that Article 80 scale, that one that's larger projects, they've both proposed parking without the city asking them to as part of their projects. And so that is really a thing that's responsive to the market in those particular areas where those developers, those proponents saw that in their situation, parking was something that they could afford, that they were interested in offering, but it wasn't a requirement, which for some
Mhm.
instances where there might be someone who's a smaller scale redeveloper, or they don't see that the tenants that they would have will be in need of that parking. It might be someone who's just building for themselves and a couple other people in their family. That requirement being there can be a burden. And so not having that requirement in certain instances is extremely helpful. And I think overall, using Mattapan as an example that we're continuing to track, we can continue to see what is showing up in terms of real parking need versus kind of an imagined sense of parking need.
So a number of years ago, we removed all parking requirements for new developments,
Hmm.
typically called parking minimums, which is that, if you build a new home, you need to build a parking spot for it. Very popular in lots of places, even in Cambridge, because A, you have some places that are quite far away from the T, where, you're more than 20, 30 minutes from a walk from the next nearest red line station. But, this feeling that, a lot of people do need a car to get around, and so you must require it in our zoning code. That's a concept that, makes sense to some regard, and people were very attached to. But we wanted to remove it all. And that's because once you remove something like a parking minimums, the day after, people can still build the same amount of parking that they could before, but they have flexibility. And it sounds very high level when you talk about that because you're like, oh, like who needs flexibility? It's just a parking spot. But the point of zoning is that there's nothing comes for free, right? So that parking spot in a place with lots of construction costs in Cambridge costs $80,000, $100,000. So you were adding 80 or $100,000 of costs to someone who's trying to buy a home, and that's not insignificant, especially if it's something that they might not use. And you think about, more suburban parts of Cambridge, and you're like, why would they not own a car? Well, not everyone can drive. Remember, zoning is universal law that applies to everyone, right? Most people might choose to drive, but some people might be disabled in a way that they can't drive or touch a car, right? There might be some people who, maybe like live next door to family and they can't really get around themselves, and so they rely on their family, but they don't need to own a car. And lots of other sorts of lifestyles. And so by having a citywide rule that we just loosened for everyone, we gave flexibility to people to live different sorts of lifestyles. And another example of that was, sometimes you would have two units side by side where they would just decide to share one car. And so the other parking spot was not necessary. By removing the requirements, you also allow them to do something like turn that into a garden or green space. Um, but, what I think is really fascinating was that this was like, uh, a hot topic because parking is always a hot topic and getting around and it
Nice.
matters so much to people. But we really decided to remove all parking minimums citywide. And what's happened in the year since is that of all the projects, the vast majority, all except one, have built the same amount of parking that they did before. Except for one project that was near transit where they could not make it pencil beforehand. And now, after parking minimums removed, they were able to build it. And in fact, what they found is that they decided to build half of as much parking as would be allowed before. But even that 50% of parking is not being utilized.